Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. We got a great episode for everyone today. Hope everyone's fingers are no longer sore from all that work we did over the last few weeks in Excel. Hope you're enjoying your new Ethicsverse MBA. We're going to be diving in today about workplace investigations, cracking the code about workplace investigations. A couple of quick announcements. You guys see this now? Yep. Follow us everywhere. So if you sign up on the Ethicsverse, you can get these invites every single week. You don't have to kind of sort through them. They'll just show up on your calendar. Follow follow Ethico in the middle here on LinkedIn, where we put all the best clips from every single week. You can stay up to date with everything that's happening in the ethics and compliance and human resource community. And follow me if you dare, okay? As usual, we're back giving away books. Our friends Rupert and Christian have written these books over the last couple of months. These are ripping through the ethics community. People love these books. These are phenomenal. And we are going to be giving away 5 of them today. So who loves you, huh? The Ethicsverse loves you. So as I'm talking about the ecosystem, drop your URL for LinkedIn. Let us know where you're coming in from. And again, I challenge you to connect with at least one person today. Your network is your net worth. Neither of them are big enough. The best thing you can do to elevate your career and elevate your impact in your organization is to build that network out of other professionals in this collegial community that we're all a part of, and reach out if you're having an issue. I guarantee you, whatever you're struggling with, there's somebody on this call or on this webinar right now who has dealt with it. The ecosystem is out. We've poured a bunch of money, a bunch of awesome new features. We've had more new features coming out every single, we have 2 releases a month, tons of new features coming out. So if you're interested in seeing that, please let us know. And with that, I will also give you a little preview of what's coming next week. We have Carrie coming in, and we're talking about the warning signs for, ethical fails. So if you're interested in that, which I'm sure you are, hope to see you here next week. And with that, I will pass it over to the coolest guy in compliance. They don't call him the coolest guy in compliance for nothing. Matt Kelly is back. How's it going, Matt?
Good. Hi, Nick. Good to be back here. So I'll take it away from here then. And thank you for having us on today. So I already see all the attendees here who have been popping where they are from in the chat box. We always like to start that off. I see we have people as far away as Botswana and Brazil and England, a couple of other places. So if you haven't yet chimed in the chat box with where you're from, please do so. We are here today to talk about investigations, and we have an excellent panel coming up. We are going to cover a couple of different angles to investigations, how you actually need to do the pre-work and foundation for having a good investigations function, how to handle the triage when you actually get a complaint of some kind, whether it comes in on the whistleblower hotline or it lands on your desk or something else. How do you figure out how serious it is and how to give it the proper treatment? And also, how do you do all of that at scale if you are a large organization and you have a zillion different complaints on many different subjects in various points of the investigation cycle? How do you, the head of compliance, manage all of that and figure out, what am I reporting to the board? What am I reporting to the general counsel? What am I just keeping an eye on? How do you make this work systematically? I want to cover all of that today. We have 2 great speakers with us in addition to Nick. First is Laila Acharya. She is head of co-founder and head of a boutique investigations firm called Crawford and Acharya. So Laila, thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks, Matt, and looking forward to this presentation.
All right, and also a veteran of investigations and corporate investigations work, John Roth, who is Vice President of Ethics and Investigations at Fannie Mae, and he's been there for a while, but he previously ran investigations in the regulatory world as well. So Jonathan, good to have you here too.
Good to be here, Matt. Thank you.
And before I get started peppering all of our guests here with questions, I'll just say one more time for everybody listening, if you have any questions you want to ask our panel today, feel free to pop those in the chat box. In theory, we save up the questions for the end, and I'll put them to our guests in practice. If you ask something really good, I'll probably just lob it to the speakers right away. Or if you have comments about what's going on, or you just want to raise some other issues, we're always happy to have listener feedback as well. So pop it into the attendee chat and we will get to it. So,
and also pepper us with these emojis. You're going to hear some really smart things from at least 3 out of 4 of us today. So if you like what you're hearing, we eat those emojis up. Okay. Just like, we might turn this into a TikTok live depending on how many emojis we end up getting here.
All right. I am old enough that I forgot to mention the emojis. I don't yet know how they work. Look, there they all go. All right. So I wanted to start by asking more of a generic question about why investigations, why getting it right is so hard. Because we, the compliance community, we could talk about investigations every single day. We'll have hundreds of people showing up every day. That has been the case for years. We cannot get enough information about how to make an investigations function work. So I just wanted to sort of lead off by asking Lila and John, and then you, Nick, as well. What do you see as the most persistent challenge for companies with investigations? Like, what is the thing that we continue to struggle with, or is most difficult or elusive for companies to get right? Lila, what do you think first, and then John, and then Nick?
Sure. So I think it's at the beginning and the end. I think a lot of folks have the middle investigation down pat, but it is the responsiveness to the reporter and getting back to the reporter, having too much time go by between the report and actually getting back to that person and doing that initial intake interview. And then the other thing I see companies struggling with is the last phase, which is the remediation phase, right? And really making sure that you are tying up and actually completing any recommended remediation actions. That's where a lot of folks kind of drop the ball, right? They think the investigation's done and nobody kind of looks to see and check whether that remediation has actually happened.
Okay. John, what do you think there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to sort of amplify what Lila says, I think the beginning of the investigation, the triage, the assessment of whether or not a complaint is coming in has legs to it, being able to separate the noise from the chaff in sort of your intake function is super important. And, when you sort of look back on sort of investigations disasters or ethics disasters where something got reported, might not have gotten reported in a very sort of compelling way, but the kernels of truth or the kernels of facts that were there should have alerted the company that this was a serious problem. So I would say, what the title of this program is, which is, separating the simple from the complex. You can have a 1,000 simple complaints that are easy to investigate, but some of those suddenly turn into things that are very serious that need your attention.
All right. And then Nick, give me your feedback too, and especially that I think what Lila and John are saying is spot on, but it was spot on when people said it 10, 15 years from now. I suspect it will be spot on 20 years from now in the future. So why are companies struggling with getting investigations running well? What do you think, Nick?
The thing I think that is missing is kind of viewing it as a business process. At the end of the day, it is a business process. There's data coming in, there's a notification coming, and then we have to push resources to, investigate, right? And I think there has been a gap in most tools and in most operations that I've kind of come in contact with around getting a good feedback loop to ensure that organizational justice or procedural justice is consistently applied across an organization. I think a lot of times we're kind of swimming in data and we're swimming in all the things that we have to get done. And sometimes we're not able to really kind of capture, are these proper steps taken across these different sort of ends of the spectrum, the simple and the complex. I think that's one. And then the other one is kind of the data analytics piece. I think many times if we're using kind of data analytics to let us see what's actually going on and aggregating that over time, there's usually some interesting trends that can help us not only do those investigations more efficiently, but also maybe prevent some of these things from happening in the workplace.
All right. And so Lila and John, like I said before, I tend to go with follow-ups and tangents and whatnot. I actually want to ask both of you a couple of points about what Nick was just saying. I think it is worth noting the way that Nick said organizational justice is something that we have to keep in mind about investigations. And I guess if you're looking to build a culture of compliance, the employees have to see that investigations are happening and like the right thing is getting done.
Right.
And how important do you think that is, or how much do you think companies struggle with like that part of it, with getting people to believe that there's a point to these investigations? Lila, what do you think about that?
I think the cultural component of this, which I've struggled with a couple of companies, relates to sort of building trust between workers and the investigative function and the senior management of a company, and having employees believe that if they raise a concern, not only is it going to be investigated appropriately, that there is going to be some type of feedback to them, even if it is just, we closed we investigated it, it's closed, and maybe they don't get the details, which is always dependent on which country you're operating in. But also the culture of confidentiality, that if they say something, it is not fodder for gossip, that not everybody at the company is going to know right away. And that really means, keeping it to that need to know basis for investigations. And that's a key function. So I'd say, it's both the feedback to your reporters when they're internal, and keeping them updated along the way that, yes, it's still going on, or, no, it's been closed. And taking clear action, particularly when it's something that, has hit the press, and people are aware of it, even outside of the company, that clear action is taken and is clearly documented. And
John, what do you think, especially since, you are VP of Investigations and Ethics? So I'd love to get your sense of how important is it that, whatever investigations you're doing, they support this greater culture so that people will believe in the investigations and give you more, and it becomes that feedback loop that Nick was talking about. Like, how do you support that sort of dynamic?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's important to understand the interrelationship between creating an ethical culture, which is really what we're trying to do, and investigations. And certainly the easiest way to dry up your hotline or get people not to trust the process is to mishandle complaints, either by not handling them appropriately or not giving feedback to the reporters. Certainly people sort of look and see what you do rather than what you say. And I think this idea that a concern is elevated and then handled in the right way goes a long way to establishing credibility for any ethics program. That's why ours are together. Investigations and ethics are together because it is so critical in establishing an ethical culture to have investigations where people get listened to and concerns get acted on.
All right. Now I'm going to pivot back to some of the practical nuts and bolts stuff. In fact, John, let me stick with you. Fannie Mae, big, complex organization, got a lot of different possible complaints that might come in. I wanted to cover a bit about what is the pre-work or foundation that a company needs to build for the investigations, such as a taxonomy of reports. Where does that come from? How important is it that it's accurate, or can you have just a couple of broad categories? Like, how do you think that through at a large organization?
Yeah, and that goes back to what Nick was saying about organizational justice, that you treat people who are similarly situated similarly. So, for us, we don't call it a taxonomy, but it is a heavy reliance on precedent. How have we handled these matters in the past? So when a complaint comes in, are we evaluating it based on sort of how it is that we understand these complaints are typically done? So wouldn't call it a taxonomy more than I would simply say you have to ensure that similarly situated employees are treated similarly.
Okay. Lila, what do you think about either the taxonomy of complaints, so you know how to organize them and try and apply some triage, or are there other preliminary steps that you need to have in place even before the first whistleblower report comes in?
Sure. So I think there's two aspects of this which I think are important. The first is, everybody has a different system. Most companies have an electronic platform that they're using, and the list of categories that you might have, handed to you by your vendor may or may not fit what actually happens at your company, right? So you can imagine that the types of concerns you might have in the retail space vary significantly from what you might have in the pharmaceutical or life sciences space. So really looking through and working closely with your vendor to make sure you've got the right kind of categories set up in your platform is step one. Step two is having a really, really good understanding and clear direction of which function in your company is handling what type of investigations. Now, not every company is blessed with a dedicated compliance investigations team, right? And a lot of companies have investigations being farmed out to the business, being handled by HR, being handled by audit or other functions. And what's important is that everyone understands when something comes in, what types of things go to which function to investigate, particularly where you don't have that clear investigations team. And you're making sure that you're able to direct that traffic appropriately so the ball's not getting dropped, so that the right person is getting there at the start to do that initial review, that initial intake interview with the reporter and moving it forward.
Okay. And Nick, I don't know if you have any thoughts here as well, but I am also just still curious about having these structures that are in place to guide things the right way when a report does come in. I see somebody already is saying that they don't like the word complaints. They prefer reports. That's a good debate to have. But Nick, what else do you see as good practice or good fundamentals that have to be in place before we even start with the call center getting calls and the whistleblower reports coming in?
I think it starts with a mindset and a mentality around what investigations, like what the role investigations play in the ethical culture that we're trying to build, to John's point. So I would say that like the investigation process is to your ethical culture what, service is to a restaurant. It's the interaction point between the people in the organization and those who can do something about it or those who can listen. And to Lila's point, sometimes these are farmed out across, the organization, and which can work fine. But when we don't have, clear kind of standards or clear principles that are guiding those decentralized investigations, we really open up a lot of variability, or at least the potential for a lot of variability in terms of like how that person feels through that interaction. Ideally, we have an ethical culture that's full of humans that are, helping us to crowdsource risk management at scale, that are helping, that are reinforcing this idea we have of, people being able to bring their whole selves to work and to, pursue whatever our organizational mission is. For that to happen authentically, people need to feel engaged and feel like they're a part of it. And I can't think of a relationship I have that's meaningful where I don't feel like it's a two-way street, where that person is listening to me and, there's that communication loop. Again, going back to those resolutions. So I think if we can start with that right mentality on the role that this should play and the sort of potential impact that it can play when we get it right, it can help guide us in building this taxonomy, for lack of a better term, to make sure that our workflows are built appropriately, that they're going to the right people quickly, because this is a game of speed at some level, right? We want to close our investigations as fast as possible, but like no faster. We don't want to trim any edges off of that and do a kind of a half-baked job on our investigation. We want to give them the right attention, but at the same time, we want the people that have raised their hand and become those ethical heroes or those guardians of the culture. We want to honor them and make sure that they know that their voice matters and that we're doing something about it. So I think that mentality really can help inform how you construct that taxonomy and how you can layer on, another dimension of like severity and hopefully algorithmically, or using the system that's in place, use workflows to push those to the right people, quickly.
John, let me ask you to talk a little bit more about some of what Nick and Lila were just saying, especially the idea, when Lila was talking about different types of people in the enterprise doing different investigations. How do you, as the nerve center, the head of investigations or compliance, how do you make sure that is happening well? It's not forbidden for auditors or internal audit or HR to do investigations, but I actually wrote down, instead of taxonomy of complaints, like taxonomy of who does what. How much could this go sideways? Have you seen it go sideways? Or how do you make sure that all of this does stay on the rails? How do you think about that, John?
Yeah, I think you have to be extremely careful that there is a, for lack of a better word, a decider, that there is an organization that is actually in control of the full panoply of complaints or reports that come in and make the decision as to where those go. So, for Fannie Mae, we have our ethics office, and they're the ones who have full control and autonomy based on policies and procedures that the board has approved. When I was Inspector General at DHS, it was the same way. The Inspector General was the responsible party for all complaints that would come in with regard to employee conduct at DHS. And from there, the decisions got made. And again, that was enshrined actually in statute. So it's important that there is a clear authority who makes those decisions and then fires it off to the right people, and then a feedback loop. So once you do dish it off to the specific entity that requires it, that there is some follow-up so you understand that it isn't simply going into a black hole.
You know, I'm going to put a question to all of the attendees, because I think what you said, John, is spot on, but the cynical part of me worries that in the real world, the general counsel will say, oh yeah, we need a decider. Well, that's me. And I'm just curious for those in the audience, what's your experience been with trying to have a clear line of authority and a decider? Is it you? Is it the compliance team? Is it general counsel? Is it somebody else? Is there nobody making clear lines of authority there? I don't know what it looks like out in the real world, but I wonder if sometimes that is a big obstacle, is just trying to assert who does what. I don't know if Lila or Nick or you have any thoughts about that, or John, if you do too, but I worry about that.
I actually, where I've seen this go well is when, you know, things coming in through the hotline are one thing, right? That's easy to see and easy to get one person to make the call. But imagine you're a large multinational operating in 40 countries, and you've got complaints walking in the door, reports walking in the door to an HR person in Botswana, or, you know, South Africa or France. And the minute that it's outside of your hotline, and it's no longer, you know, being a report coming into your centralized function, the wheels fall off the bus, right? If you don't have any type of protocol that your folks internationally have been trained on, and that it's, you know, correctly adapted for, you know, the EU whistleblowing environment, right? So, you know, I think for when we're talking, you know, bet the company investigations, yes, the GC is going to, you know, be that person making those decisions and getting the outside counsel. But on your day-to-day reports that are coming in, particularly that's coming in outside the hotline, you may have no insight into that at US headquarters. And unless you have widespread use of a tool, widespread training, and a very clear protocol of what investigators, whether they're HR, audit, or anyone else, are supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be feeding that information, et cetera. And I think companies tend to overlook that, you know, oh, we've got everything together here in the US, or maybe we have it all together in Europe, but the rest of the world, you know, sometimes is a mystery.
Yeah, and I think that's so spot on, because to the extent that you're using that central system to draw conclusions, and you have no idea how much coverage that central system has relative to all the issues that are going on in your organization, the odds of like statistical, you know, errors are wildly high. Those protocols in place, whether it's
your input, right? Like your output of your data is only as good as your input, and if people aren't 100%. Actually putting your reports and investigations in your platform, your data is not that useful.
Yep. All right. So setting up those proxy forms and having, you know, a simple web form that's out there with that's kind of self-explanatory can help do a lot to, you know, gather more of those things. But if you have no way to do that, we wind up exactly where Lila just said, you know.
Right. I mean, I think it absolutely needs to be enshrined into some sort of procedure or other sort of high-level governance that, you know, you have an obligation as an employee of X company to report to a specific place, regardless of your function or regardless of your location, assuming that your local laws allow that kind of a thing.
I will give a shout out to some other attendee who's just said compliance gets to make the decisions because legal doesn't like to make any decisions. So there you go. How much can you automate some of this intake, especially if you're at a larger company with potentially hundreds of reports coming in or thousands over the course of the year? I know that there are a lot of people who say that some of this can be automated. And if it's coming in online, there is a way to put some structure to that and be able to extract like key facts, I guess, to be able to get some automation and reporting. But, you know, how scalable is that, or how do you make sure that nothing falls through the cracks? John, since you're at I think probably the largest organization here, what do you think about those ideas? And then Lila, and then Nick.
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous game. I will just say, I think the critical risk that any entity faces is missing complaints, because your reporters are not going to be able to sort of clearly and concisely report essential facts in a way that a machine is going to pick it up. They are angry, they're confused, they are resentful, they are, any one of a number of things that requires sort of trained individuals to engage in a conversation with them to sort of fully understand the nature of the complaint. So the complaint that comes in might not actually be their complaint at all. It might be something completely different. And, I would just say that every sort of train wreck that we've seen, right? So, Michigan State on the Nassar case, the Wells Fargo. I mean, complaints came in about bad behavior and came in for years and nothing was done. To me, that is the critical risk that any company faces, is that employees report the actions and then nothing happens. So I would be extraordinarily careful about any automation whatsoever, because I do think that is a false economy.
Sure. Nick, what do you think about this? And then Lila.
I mean, it's probably not a black and white thing. I was talking with someone yesterday who had a solution in place where there was no categories. They opted for no categories on their web form because they didn't want to confuse folks. And so they had a whole person dedicated, a whole highly trained ethics and compliance person dedicated to just sorting through all of these cases. Again, I'm kind of sequestering this part of the conversation on a straight up web form, but I think it's it's at least an extreme version, or at least a far end of the spectrum on the other side where there's no automation. That leaves sort of just a single individual to sort of sort through all those pieces of hay in the haystack to find the needles. I think there can be a happy medium in the middle, and take this as a grain of salt, given the business that I'm in. But I think you can build some smart logic into web forms. You can build some simple categories. You can do some keyword overlays to help put a little bit of a magnet next to that haystack to pull some of those needles out. I don't think, to John's point, that until sort of AI is really embedded in all these tools and our AI overlords are really kind of directing everything we do, there's going to need to be some human interaction to sort through those things. I think on average, someone is probably going to misstate their issue to the high side of severity than the low side. I don't think someone's going to mistakenly understate a fraud or sexual harassment or something. I think maybe they would probably overstate it. So if you can have some sort of smart, quasi-algorithmic things in place that can flag those higher severity things and route those through a notification to somebody individually, or you can have an intake partner that can review those review those reports on your behalf relative to your directives and say, okay, this sounds really more like a discrimination case than a XYZ case. Those are some ways that we can utilize the people on our teams who are, probably higher paid, who are more well trained and know the sort of ethos and playbooks of the kind of culture we're trying to create, utilize them better, a better use of their time actually to hit the ground running on the investigation. So there's no easy answer. I think it takes some thought. And I think, to John's point, though, you do run the risk of just blindly plugging something in and sitting back and thinking this is all going to take care of itself. It's going to be a bit of an art and a science.
Yeah. I would love the attendees who are chatting away here. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on the automated case intake and what are the limits there, or what are your concerns? Because John and Nick have already raised a bunch of good points about this. And while people are popping those answers in, Lila, what's your take on all of it? Because it seems like there is still a lot of risk to doing this. What's your sense? I think
this is maybe echoing what I said before. If you're a company that thinks all of your reports are coming in through your hotline, or if that is actually what's happening, you have a serious problem, because the hotline shouldn't be necessarily the go-to place. What you want culturally is you want your personnel to feel comfortable going to a manager, going to HR, going to functions where they're actually making a call or walking into somebody's office and saying, I have a concern, let's talk. And so, somebody on here said, you must have I think it was Rick. Rick says you must have human interaction with investigations. And that is absolutely right. To Nick's point, I've had numerous web reports coming through a hotline handed to me that are indecipherable or maybe way overstated, occasionally understated. And you really have to reach out and contact that person to be able to make heads or tails of what should happen with that report. So I'm very skeptical that that triage can really be that automated without a human element. And again, if that's all you have a problem, because you want your ideally your personnel to not really be going to the last line other than the hotline as a last resort.
Here's a good point from Kurt. Concerns that our reporters mistakenly think that they are only going to get an automated response. We try to engage them individually within 24 hours. Kurt, I think that's a great practice. You try and get back to them. B, let's remember under the GDPR in Europe, that's what you're supposed to do with complaints. You're supposed to get back to whistleblowers individually within, I think, 7 days or something like that. But, the ability to launch a conversation with the whistleblower or the reporter and have it be an ongoing relationship is very important in a lot of these whistleblower laws. And I remain unconvinced that automated solutions will be able to help you with that, let alone when we get to AI chatbots. And John, you talking about when people call up and they're upset and they're curt and they don't know what to do. And good luck having ChatGPT talk somebody off that cliff. I don't see how that works very well, at least not today, not tomorrow. I don't know when it will, but okay. Here's somebody correcting me. It's the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive, not the GDPR. Thank you, correcting me on that. Let me also ask, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about the ongoing monitoring of a complaint.
Sorry. Can I just pause you, Matt? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I mean, you said something that really resonated with me, that this is kind of the start of a conversation and start of a relationship. And I think we can strategically use these interactions to really set the stage for a better investigation. Like the eyes eat first, those initial impressions of the process can really cast can cast a shadow or cast light, I guess, over how that thing can go. So working with your hotline provider or somebody like that, or making sure that all the, you have the protocols in place so that if someone goes to a manager, just simply thanking them for speaking up and telling them what they can expect. Those are a couple of simple steps that can help kind of lower some of the anxiety and get a little bit more participation with that person when you're in the throes of the actual investigation, Sorry, though, back to your question.
No. That's fine. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to what comes next. The report has been made. You have triaged it and assigned it to the proper category, but circumstances change. And so I wanted to talk a little about how you monitor investigations as they evolve. And, how do you assure that if something takes a sudden turn or it's related to a different complaint you got 2 weeks ago and they're actually connected and now put 2 and 2 together, that you have a much bigger issue. How do you build those sort of monitoring systems and red flag detection systems to be able to understand when an investigation becomes more severe? John, let me start with you. How do you try and develop that sort of ongoing capability?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing you do is you make sure that you have a high quality team, and that's both in hiring and training, and then sort of ensuring that they understand that escalation is a good thing, that they need to sort of continually sort of check in and report and sort of hash through sort of the cases that they're doing. So there is that good positive communication. And then you need metrics, of course, like every business needs metrics, which is, what is your case cycle time? What is your caseload per investigator? We have, and I think most typical businesses have, a case management system that will be able to link various kinds of, reporters or subjects of investigations, so you sort of understand the interaction between perhaps two otherwise disparate complaints, and then sort of the meta kind of analysis of, what are we seeing? Are we seeing more of a specific type of complaint, more of a specific type of investigation? Is this something that we need to focus a little bit more on? Does this need to get escalated beyond the investigation sphere to like the compliance officer or to senior management? Those kinds of things. But I think it really starts with the people that you've hired and trained to actually do the investigation. You can't underestimate what a well-trained and motivated investigator can do.
All right. Lila, what do you think?
I think that's 100% spot on, but I would add that, again, many companies do not have the luxury of a centralized investigations team. And when you're dealing with the decentralized model, it's the same concept. You need to identify who in the business, who in different functions are essentially your investigators, right? And make sure that they have that training and they understand the escalation routes, et cetera. So you can still replicate this model even if you don't have that centralized team. It takes a little bit more work. Maybe it takes a little bit of travel to go and make sure you're identifying the right people who can play these roles. But in today's day and age with what we're doing right now, right? It's not hard to get people on a video call, once a week, once every 2 weeks for a check-in on your key cases, and make sure that people have that opportunity to ask questions, of whether or not they're handling something the right way, whether something needs to have a third-party expert like a forensic accountant or somebody like that to join, or even whether you need to send something to outside counsel. It's about communication, whether it's with your internal, your key centralized team or a decentralized team.
And Nick, give me your thoughts here. Especially, I love what John was saying about this really is good case management capabilities. That's what you need to develop. And I wonder how many companies actually have those capabilities developed compared to, say, a whistleblower program, which you can depend on a vendor for it. There's, I think, a lot more structure on a sort of a plug and play for a whistleblower intake. I'm not sure that's true with case management, but they do have to be seamless. So I can kind of see where this might become a bottleneck or get a little wobbly. But Nick, what do you think?
So I think, just like all fast food restaurants aren't the same, I don't think all the intake across the industry is the same. I think there's different levels of customization that are available. There's different sort of like ethoses behind how those are run. But assuming that is kind of true, I think to your point, this case management is not just the tool itself, it's the overlay of the protocols. It's how the team is interacting with these individual cases that are coming through. And I think the thing that stuck out to me from what John was saying, which I think he's absolutely spot on. I think he said, don't underestimate what a motivated investigator can do. I think that's right. We have to empower those people and give them sort of the clear runway to go and put their gifts to work to close the loops on these things. I think the feedback loop, again, how can a leader of an investigation team have confidence that every single one of those investigations are falling within the tolerance of what they expect relative to the process they built. I think if we're not spending time sort of reviewing how those look, sometimes you see two different investigators and one is doing all the steps and one is doing 2/3 of the steps. How are you notified of that? How often are you doing reviews of people's caseloads to see how these things are progressing, and are those things kind of following the right sort of protocols relative to the severity or relative to the category or whatever. So I've just seen a really wide spectrum of people applying this sort of case management across their team, which again is kind of irrespective of whatever tool you're actually working in every single day,
Well, my concern, I guess, would be that you might have silos of case management. A couple of people had already commented about tickets and reports coming in. They said our help desk is really well trained in this. And that got me thinking, okay, the IT help desk probably has a great case management system, but I'm not sure how often they might handle privacy or security issues, and compliance would have visibility into this is what they're doing over there. Ditto for HR, looking into personnel issues, or other people who might have inconsistent approaches to case management, and then suddenly things start falling through the cracks, or you, the nerve center, you misunderstand how important some things are or aren't becoming. John, I don't know if you have any thoughts about how to sort of normalize that case management fear I was talking about. I don't even know how legitimate that fear is. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to have a funnel, or what we call the funnel. So, yep. An employee makes a report to a supervisor. What is the supervisor's obligation? Does that supervisor know where to take that information and that issue? I think it's important that you have some sort of policy that requires that person to escalate it to a specific, well-known, well-trusted place. For us, it's the ethics office, to be able to sort of ensure that we document it. We have a central case management system, as I did at DHS, as I did at the Food and Drug Administration, to be able to track all these things. So, assuming that everyone follows the policies correctly, you do have that funnel and it is recorded, and then you can measure it and do the kinds of things that you need to do. But, it is an ethical responsibility for people managers to report up to ethics any issues or concerns that they receive in the course of their duties. So,
all right. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we already have a bunch of questions coming in from the attendees. Like I expected at the beginning, because I said we could talk about investigations all day long, and here are the questions. Somebody did ask, should investigators be based on subject matter expertise? So data privacy reports are investigated by the data privacy officer, financial crime investigated by the anti-money laundering office, and so forth. I don't know if John or Lila, do you have any particular views on that question and that issue?
I do think there is something to be said for having the folks with the right skill set investigating particular matters. So when I was a line investigator at a large pharma company, I frequently would partner with somebody from internal audit, right? If there was like data and spreadsheets and numbers that had to be crunched. I'm a great lawyer, but there's some things, I know my limits, right? So making sure that your team has the right people on it and with the right expertise, absolutely. And if you have those dedicated functions, yes, with the caveat of let's make sure there's not a conflict, right? I've had folks say to me in the past, like, ooh, so-and-so should do this investigation because she knows the reporter best. Absolutely not, right? We've got to always maintain objectivity and independence, and make sure that just because somebody is in the right function or has a particular skill set, that you've also kind of checked that box on objectivity and independence, and there's no potential conflict there.
Sure. John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think some of it depends on your regulatory responsibilities as well. So, for example, if you're in a financial services industry, you're going to have very specific and strict requirements about, for example, the expertise that you are required for your anti-money laundering group. So that is going to be an absolutely different skill set than sort of a straight up ethics office that is simply looking at employee complaints about, sort of EEO or some other kind of a thing like that. Likewise, with privacy, and knowledge of sort of what the privacy requirements are, I think is probably something where regulators would look at that and want to make sure that it isn't a generalist that is handling these, but that it is somebody who is sort of trained and has a background in that kind of information.
Sure. I have two quick thoughts. Number one, where Lila, you were talking about pairing up with the internal audit. So reason number 200 and 700 million about why compliance should be BFFs with internal audit, yet again, just for something like that. But John, you talking about the regulatory expertise. I also know, for example, with trade sanctions and OFAC enforcement, OFAC has been explicit that, they outright say, compliance with our rules is hard. You should have a very sophisticated compliance team who knows what they're doing with sanctions. Not even just a regular compliance team, but sanctions compliance. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into that. Somebody else asking, how do you navigate investigations with non-employees? They don't say whether that is a third party operating in your enterprise or just somebody more peripherally involved with your company. I'm not sure. But
sorry, can we circle back to the last question, Matt?
Oh yeah, sure.
I just would like to. Yeah, sorry. I just, not everybody has like, a really kind of massive team where they can push out kind of investigations to privacy. And so I think, maybe a hybrid approach is a little bit more of a centralized, function where there's, a kind of a line investigator, so to speak, or a generalist who's really kind of navigating that maybe, relatively more hairy investigation through the process and getting those inputs from those subject matter experts within the organization. I think one benefit of that kind of an approach, while it requires a little bit more collaboration, you will have a little bit more control and like a little bit like tighter standard deviation around kind of outcomes if that person is really dialed in on like how we want these investigations to be handled and so forth. It makes sort of teaching a little bit easier, and those people can sort of they can bring in the resources that they need for those, for whatever case they're talking about. So again, as usual, there's never like one great answer. We have to kind of make the best of whatever our situation is and drive toward whatever ideal is kind of, represented by that next summit on this mountain of risk that we're climbing,
Investigations of non-employees. Lila, let me ask you first, what are your thoughts about that? I don't know how often you might have encountered a situation like that.
Oh, a bunch.
All right, what do you got for us?
Usually in the third party context, right? So you've got a distributor, you've got a sales consultant, you've got somebody, maybe a vendor who there's some issue there that you need to sort out. And, the first question that you have to deal with there is legal privilege, right? Because as soon as you're speaking with parties unaffiliated with your company, outside third parties, that the privilege is not going to attach. And I'm not saying that all third party investigations need to be, done under privilege. We got to think about what the legal issue is there. How significant is it? And what are you going to do about it? Generally speaking, I say the safest bet is to find out as much as you can internally first, from your internal personnel about the issue. If you need to even do an email review or other type of document or data review, to wrap your hands around what is the issue, what do we as a company actually know about this before you go outside and request to do either it's exercising audit rights of your third party, or even just an interview of the third party about the issue. Just know as much as you can possibly know before you venture outside of the company to have those discussions. That is generally my approach on those things. Obviously, like we're talking about a wide range of issues, but I have had interviews of third parties, and I have participated in exercising audit rights of third parties, which often can get you the answer you're looking for without even having to raise to them the subject of the report. A lot of companies have those audit rights in their contracts with the third parties. They don't exercise them, but that's a fantastic investigative tool if you do have a concern that you think you could potentially find the answer to by exercising those audit rights.
All right. John, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think to Lila's point, some of this depends on, are we talking about sort of third parties, suppliers, vendors, those kinds of things, or is this an outside party in which, your company is the victim? Those are going to be sort of important considerations to think about. And also sort of other considerations. Is this like a fraud risk? Is this reputational risk? Is it some other kind of risk that you're dealing with? I think it's important to sort of understand it's different than pure internal investigations in which you're sort of dealing with an ethical culture and trying to minimize risk to the company based on, employees doing things to each other. So we have a separate team that deals with sort of those kinds of third-party risks. But I think it's important to sort of understand what are the consequences or what is at risk when you start on these kinds of investigations.
All right. Nick, any thoughts on this one?
I was just going to share that there was a couple of comments in the main chat that I'd love to hear what John and Lila have to say. I think we talked about kind of non-payroll employees, but what about when there's a field investigation required in this context? Or John asked about investigations in franchise systems, which I think is a kind of an interesting thing because there's this loose affiliation. What sort of tips would you guys have? Maybe we can start with the franchise one. What kind of tips would you have for someone kind of conducting those types of investigations?
Well, I got nothing, so I'll leave it to Leela or Matt on that one.
Yeah, I'd say franchises are difficult. So like I'll use the example of let's just take like a Dunkin' Donuts, okay, or a McDonald's, where perhaps the investigation is of a franchise of the corporate structure. I think you need to look at the particular franchise agreement and strategize clearly with your legal department and outside counsel, depending what the issue is, before you move along and conduct that investigation, because the franchisee may have a certain amount of independence, and it varies by company. So that's all I can really say for this point. And just to the part about non-employee personnel. So often we have third-party contractors working for a company. It's super important to check the contract that you have, if it's like a temp or a contractor, with their agency, because typically they will have an obligation to participate as a witness in an investigation, but you do have to give notice to the agency or the contractor for whom they're employed, so that that they're aware of it and they have the opportunity to participate in that interview. Typically, they may or may not want to, depending on the subject matter. But it's a little bit of more of a minefield to navigate, just from an investigation perspective, if it's that type of third-party worker.
I certainly, I'm not a lawyer and I am not a professional investigator, so I'll just concede to whatever Lila and John are talking about. But I would say that all of what you're talking about here strikes me as, number one, the importance of having proper contracts in place at the start. So if you want to look at the third party, like using an audit rights, I think that's a wonderful idea. It assumes that you have it in the contract. But also dealing with things like franchises or whatnot, certainly it all comes back to, do you understand what your actual risks are? And therefore, how to structure the proper contracts and when to put the shoulder to the grindstone and say, we're going to make this a big deal. Somebody who would ask about field investigations. I don't know what the threshold for doing that would be. And if Lila and John have thoughts, I'd love to hear them. But clearly, that would be a big threshold. And do you know when you want to do that? Because then the cat's out of the bag. Everybody's going to know something's happening. So just the importance of thinking all of that through at the beginning. But if anybody has any comments about when to go for a field investigation, that is a question somebody asked. Nope. All right. Let's see. I guess maybe then the last question I would want to ask, because we only have about a couple of minutes left, is, what would you typically want to put in a report, not about an investigation, but about the overall state of investigations at the company right now? If you were going to give a report to the board saying, here's what we're doing, here's how things look, do you talk about investigations generally and then maybe the top 2 or 3 most pressing that they might already know about? Is there something different that you would present to the board or the management team about, here's investigations overall? Like, John, what would you say about that? And then Lila, if you have any thoughts, and then Nick too.
Yeah, I think you have to create a balance there between too much granularity and information that the board absolutely needs to know about the ethical health of the company. So, wrapping up statistics as to sort of the number of investigations, the seriousness of them, perhaps the number of investigations that resulted, for example, in employee discipline or termination, anything that involves, for example, financial reporting, would be absolutely critical for the board to know. So some of this is, what drives the board, what is their obligation to understand, and then you sort of move backward from there. But you'd have to be careful to balance sort of information that they need to know against way too much granularity.
Sure. Lila, any advice?
I think it varies, obviously, depending on the size of the company that we're talking about and the sophistication of your investigations function and the data that you have. It's important to be as transparent as possible. I'll say that much. Don't say what you don't know, right? Especially to the board. If you don't really know how many reports are walk-in reports to HR, and being investigated in other countries, then don't pretend that you do. The other thing I'd say is it's helpful, I think, for boards to see any sort of benchmarking data you can give. So whether that's, companies of our size in this industry, the vendors out there have different reports they put out and say, a company of 100,000 employees should have X percent, X number of hotline calls to their hotline. So that there's benchmarking data out there that you can try to get that relates to your company or the size of your company that can kind of show the board where you are within your industry, and where you are within, the size of your company. And also just a signal to them, any ideas or plans that you may have to further improve your compliance program, to plant the seeds for their buy-in. So if you know that let's say you're a paper-based system and you don't have a hotline right now, and let's hope you're not in the financial services sector, because you surely should have one, or a publicly traded company, because you should. But let's just say you're a small company and you don't have a hotline and you want to, move towards having one. Building that, concept with the board and planting those seeds for why you should be moving that direction, I think is really important to kind of build from the tone at the top, as you're moving your program forward.
All right. And then Nick, I'll give you the last word here and then we can wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, Lila kind of stole all my points. So what I'd say is, if you're presenting to the board, it's a great opportunity for persuasion. It's a great opportunity to convey that there's a competent person over this thing. I think the board generally wants to know kind of like where we're at, where we want to go, and kind of what we're going to do to get there. And I think if you can keep that kind of a framework in place, then you can avoid some of the pitfalls that John alluded to of like getting caught up in too much of the minutia and too much of the sort of detailed statistics that they don't really care about. To the extent that we can convey to them that we're taking sort of active steps to, improve the ethical sort of standing of the organization and plant those seeds for future budget that we are going to need to really kind of expand the impact and build the type of organization they want. It's a golden opportunity to do that. So I appreciate everyone for coming. Lila, round of applause for Lila. John, of course. Matt, back in the saddle. I'm so glad to have you guys here and sharing so much with us. Hope you guys can join us next week where we'll be diving into ethical failures. And thank you for all of these emojis. We are going to be eating over 800 emojis today. So I don't even need lunch anymore. This is phenomenal. So thank you guys all. We will see you next time on the Ethicsverse. Take care.
All right. Thank you.